So in this exercise, we're going to work on our curved sewing. And this is a curved flap, like a pocket flap. And in level 1, we did another curve which was for a pocket flap, but it was much smaller and more narrow. And what I wanted to practice here is our understitching. So we have 2 flaps here, and this is for more of like a couture flap, a jacket pocket flap, something that has a nicer fabric. I have a top flap and an under flap, and the under flap is actually slightly smaller than the top flap. And what that does, you'll have to stretch your sewing. And what that does is it forces the turn of the top flap onto the bottom, so there's no seam line. After we sew that seam line, we're going to come back and we're going to understitch all the way around. So this will be a very good practice exercise, and it may take you more than a couple of tries to get this done right. So I thought this would be more of an advanced thing for level 2. So just like the other top flaps, we're going to fuse the top flap. We're going to cut these separately. Cut one of the top flap, cut one of the under flap, and then cut one fusible of the top flap. And then we'll be ready to sew. So I have notches here that indicate our seam line. It's 1/4 of an inch. So I'm just going to clip this really quick with my notcher. And again, it's 1/4 of an inch, so I'm just going to go in and clip these to identify that seam allowance, just 1/8 of an inch. All right, and now I'm all ready to cut this out of fabric and fusible. Okay, so now that everything is cut out and clipped, we need to mark for the face sides. So remember, we have a top and an under. Do you remember which is which? So go ahead and pull out your pattern pieces. Remember that your under flap is slightly smaller, so all you have to, than your top. So all you have to do is match up your pattern pieces, and look, there we have it. So remember that the fusing goes onto the top flap. And just a reminder, when you cut out the fusing, the textured side, which has the glue side, should be facing up toward the pattern. So your pattern should look like this, and then you can cut out the interfacing like that. So let's go ahead and mark these. This is the top, so I'm going to mark it like we normally do. And then if you remember in level 1, the under flap of the previous exercise, we did crosses for the under flaps of those pockets. So this is how I will identify the under flap. This is the top flap, and then I can flip the top flap over to the wrong side, and I'm going to fuse this to the wrong side of the top pocket flap. All right, so what we need to do now, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to fuse that, go to the ironing mat, fuse that together, and then we'll be all ready to stitch. Okay, so we're ready to begin constructing our pocket flap. And if you look at the pieces right now, you may be able to see notice a difference. And that's the under flap is smaller than the top flap. And that's because we want the top flap to roll to the underside. So I have fused the top flap So that's the side that we wanted to fuse. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the under flap and I'm going to just match it here to the top flap. And notice I have an edge all the way around where the top is much larger than the under flap. And we're actually going to be stretching this all in together. So, and then we're going to do some understitching, but my notches match, right? So we're going to match the notches. So I've got this notch over here I'm going to match, and I'll put a pin there. And then I've got this notch here. I probably shouldn't have turned that around. I need this other side, this notch, and I'll put a pin here, right there at the top. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to find that about the center here of the flap, and I'm going to pull that down to match that edge, and I'll put a pin there. So now I have my curves, and so I'm going to pull the curve over and just match those curves. Do the same thing here on the opposite side. Pin that. And now all of my edges are pretty much matching, and I've got everything kind of, I've got that even on everything. But if we flip this over, yes, we can definitely see that the top is larger than the under. So we're going to put this side on the feed dog. So we're going to sew this way. I'm going to start here at this edge, and underneath the feed dogs will help pull that into fitting into the under flap as we go. I might have to even that out a little bit. Once we get to here, we'll be stretching to get that top to fit into the under flap, right? And then we'll be doing some understitching on the under flap side. So we'll come back here and I'll discuss that once we get this all sewn all the way around. Okay, so we're all ready to sew our pocket flap together. So this is a 1/4 inch seam all the way around, and my stitch length is 12 to 14 stitches per inch. That's our regular stitch length. And remember that our top flap is larger than our under flap because we want the top flap to roll to the underside. So as we go around here, we're going to be needing to stretch a little, and with the feed dog's help, it should ease right into this long part. This is the part that's going to have the hardest time. I'm going to pull this pin out once I get around to this curve, and that will actually loosen things up so we can actually stretch a little bit more. And don't worry about the stretching because that's all going to come back on to itself. It will work itself out. So I'm going to start up here. I'm going to remove this pin. I'm going to get started 1/4 inch seam allowance right at that notch, and I'm going to back stitch to start. All right. So as I come up to the curve, if you have a tighter curve, you can, of course, increase your stitches per inch through the curve area, but I think I'm going to be okay because this curve isn't super tight. Take this pin out, and I'm getting around that, and I'm holding this and I'm curving, pulling this in a curve as I'm going around it from the back side. And now I'm going to come around to the front of that curve, and I'm going to put my needle down right at this point, right where it starts to go straight. I'm going to pull this pin out, right? And now I'm just going to pull and stretch it because I want the top flap to ease in there. And sometimes you can come in here behind and just kind of see where my finger is, just kind of ease it in as you're stitching. You're going to be pushing that top flap into the sewing line. I'm gonna have to take this pin out because I don't think I got enough. Okay, so now my edges are matching, and so now I'm going to have to work on my curve. So I'm going around. I probably could have turned my stitch length down, but now I want to make sure that I'm getting this eased in here. And then I'm going to backstitch at the end. And now we'll have a look at this, make sure I didn't get any puckers or gathers. Whoops. Let's see if I got one here. That's a mistake. So I'm going to take that out. I'm going to restitch that. I'm going to take the stitch out so that this can happen. So good teaching moment here. I'm going to rip out from about here to the top and see if I can ease that back in. Okay, so I've ripped it out a little bit further, actually past that curve, because I think that curve is where I got too much in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start here. I'm going to start a few stitches before the end of this line. So that's where I'll put my needle. And this is how I correct things. Sometimes things don't work out on the first go around. And I'm just going to put my finger under here and I'm going to help aid this. Let me just go ahead and pull the top, right? I'm holding on to it and I'm kind of stretching it, making sure everything is smooth. And then I'm going to start, and then I'm going to have to go around this. Gotta get this pin out now. Okay. And I do these little short bursts that kind of helps pull in a little bit more fabric. Okay. So now this is important for you to understand. If you see something that you have sewn that seems to be incorrect, at the time, you want to go back and correct it before you turn it in. Make sure you turn in your best work. So you need to go back and anything that you see that is not right, you need to rip it out, restitch it, and do it again. Don't turn in work that you know is incorrect. So we're not done with this yet. We need to do the understitching, and we need to do the understitching to the under flap. So again, your seam allowance will be turned to the under flap, and then on the top side of the under flap is where we're going to stitch right here, a 1/16 of an inch away from that seam all the way around. And remember, these curves are going to be kind of tricky. All right, so I'm going to switch to my narrow foot as I did for the Peter Pan collar. I'm going to switch to the narrow foot, and then I'm also going to reposition the camera so hopefully you can see inside where I'm sewing. Okay, so I've switched to my narrow foot and I've got my pocket flap here. Again, we're going to be understitching the seam allowance to the under pocket flap, which is the side that does not have the interfacing on it. So make sure your seam allowance is going that way. So I'm folding it this way and I'm going to put it into the machine. I'm actually going to just kind of get it started here, and I'm going to run this seam right on the edge of my presser foot. That's a good distance from the seam. So I'm just going to backstitch to start. And then what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be kind of pulling away the top flap and the bottom flap away from that seam as I sew. Trying to avoid any kind of puckering, and then also making sure that I get this seam allowance toward the under flap. And I've got to try to flatten this so you can kind of see it, which makes it a little bit more difficult. But I will just continue sewing and see all this ruffling or pleating or gathering here. We don't want that to happen. So it's easier to do if I don't have to worry about a camera or anybody seeing me. I'm just going to be pulling away from it, right? And I'm hoping that I'm not going to get any of these in there. And as I sew, right, if you feel like it's getting out of control, you can stop, lift the presser foot, and kind of position all of that fabric. But I'm going to just power through this. Once I get past those curves, it's kind of smooth sailing for a little bit until I come back to this other curve. And I'm going to kind of get ready for that. I'm watching how far away that seam is getting from my foot, making sure that it looks kind of even, all of this extra gathering. This is the curve now, right? And I don't want to get any puckers there caught in that needle. Okay, we'll see how well that worked. I'm at the end. I'm just going to backstitch. You don't really necessarily need to backstitch at the beginning or end of this because it's going to go into a seam. So let me trim these. Okay, I'm gonna pull the camera back really quick. Okay, so the camera's pulled back. So this is what it looks like on the inside. It's a little further away than some of the other understitchings that I've done. So let's just kind of quickly turn it face side out and see what it looks like. So this is the underside. You can see it's a little further away than I would really like it, but it works okay. It's actually pretty even. I usually like it a little bit closer, but that's okay. We just use the edge of the foot here. So we're not quite done with this. I'm actually going to turn it to wrong side out again, because see here on the corners, we've got some extra fabric and rippling, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna trim that just like we trim for our concave and convex. So we're just gonna trim this really close here so we can kind of get rid of that, especially here where this is actually a convex away, and we're just going to trim that so we don't have to have any clipping there. Okay, so I will actually do that over at the pressing mat. Okay, so we're all ready to finish up our pocket flap, and this one gave us a little trouble, didn't it? But we got it all worked out. So just like the Peter Pan collar, instead of clipping around these edges, I'm going to trim this extra seam allowance very close to the edge here on the underside, right? Because we want to get close to our understitching. So that's what I'm going to do here. And you may need to pull back some of your top pocket area. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that all the way around, very close to the edge. Be careful not to actually cut your pocket. I'm being very careful. I'm getting a little bit closer than I thought I might get. So we'll see what this looks like once we get that all done. Be careful of these corners, because some of this fabric might fold over, and you might clip it, and you don't want to do that. Okay, so there we are. Now let's turn it to the face side. Okay, and this is the top side. We need to make sure this edge comes up here, right? Because we did that stretching to make it even. So I'm just going to pin that up there, because that's why we need to see it, that these two edges up here are matching. And this is our top pocket. Oops, I need to repin those. There we go. I got a little uneven there. Okay. And this is our top pocket part. So now we can press this, and that's all turning under to the underside, so we don't see any seam at all. Right? You see the top pocket all the way around. I'm going to give that one more. Looks like I need to trim some of these threads off again. Okay. So one more press. And so there's our pocket flap with the understitching, and the top pocket is completely rolled over to the under pocket flap. So now we can label this, and I would label this on the underside. So pocket flap with understitching, and that's ready to go into your notebook. Don't forget your name and the date.